Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, The Operational Reality of Statewide Data Ambitions, an exploration of 3 models, part 3, Federated Models. My name is Amy, and I am the Membership Associate at National States Geographic Information Council. If you are unfamiliar with our organization, NSGIC exists to advance effective national coordination of geospatial information by supporting state-level cooperation. We serve as a national forum for the development of capable and future-oriented geospatial leadership. If you'd like to know more information on how to get involved, please visit us at www.nsgic.org. I will pop that address into the chat box shortly. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to today's presenters. Kate?
All right, thank you, Amy. Great to be back. So this is part 3 in a 3-part series, so the last part. We presented briefly at the NSGIC Annual introducing 3 models for enterprise data projects, those being centralized, federated, and decentralized models. In part 2, which was a webinar format on November 3rd, we took a deeper dive into the 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, being the centralized and decentralized model. And today, we're pleased to offer the final piece of the puzzle here, focusing on the federated data model. So we'll do a couple of quick introductions and then dive into the material. So Bill and I are here today from AppGeo. AppGeo is a geospatial consulting firm. We're based in Boston, Massachusetts, and we're doing work, lots of strategic planning work and other types of work in dozens of states around the country. We've been in business for 30 years now. We celebrated our 30-year anniversary, and through those 30 years, doing an evolution of projects from application development, database design, system integration, and the planning pieces that are closely related to this webinar series here. So we're a proud longtime sponsor of NSGIC, and we really value this community. Bill here today is our Carpe Geo evangelist, a unique title indeed. And I'm Kate Hickey, our Chief Operating Officer.
Great, and thank you, Kate. And I want to welcome our 2 special guests today from Kansas. And there's an interesting question about why Kansas, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. But Ken is the State Geographic Information Officer, the GIO. He runs the Digital Access and Support Center. That's what DASC stands for. And his colleague Eileen is the Clearinghouse Manager at DASC. And you may be wondering why I put Ted Lasso on this slide. Well, if you're a fan of that show, you know that the lead character, Ted Lasso, hails from Kansas. And in reality, Jason Sudeikis, who is the creator and star of that show, hails from Kansas. He, in fact, attended the high school one over from where Ken and Eileen went, and he's the hometown hero. But more importantly, that infectious positivity, that kind of Kansas nice vibe, is very authentic, and I think that's why the show works. And I think you're going to hear some of that when you hear Ken and Eileen talking as this webinar unfolds.
Now you've set the bar high, Bill, for entertainment value here. So we don't want to repeat too much of what we shared with you in a previous webinar, but we just want to set the stage for this discussion on the frameworks that we're thinking about here. So when you think about these various enterprise data models, and you begin to understand them and their differences and how you can mix and match them, you realize that perhaps you have more options than you initially thought. These models that we're going to talk about, they provide a framework or a structure, tinker toys here, to evaluate the efficiency and the effectiveness of your current data programs and an envisioned data program. So they can also help clarify the trade-offs in choosing one approach over another. And I think you'll begin to hear about some of those trade-offs that Ken and Eileen considered. So, as we dive into their story today and walk through their program, some of the factors you're going to hear about are cost. So certainly cost plays an important role in any of these projects, but thinking about who should shoulder the costs under these different models, which are the most cost effective for which types of data models, authority, who's the authoritative data source, who has the funding? To what degree does local control impact the flow of data? And then, of course, the implications. So, picking a data model, thinking about which approach is going to result in the greatest consistency, the greatest discoverability and access to data, the greatest capabilities and resources between partners. So, it's important. It's not just important for the leaders of a program to understand these data models, but it's important for all of your stakeholders to understand them too. So they understand what model they're operating under, and it helps them appreciate their role and their contribution to that model and what happens if they don't participate.
All right, so if you attended any of our previous two parts, you've seen this slide before, so I won't dwell on it, but just very quickly, what you really want to be thinking about in terms of how these models work is where is the authority and how do roles map out in the way that authority is manifested in these models. The decentralized and centralized that you see on the left and right side, they're the easiest to understand. I think natively we all kind of get it when we talk about centralized and decentralized. And that's what we spent a lot of time last month breaking that down and unpacking it and explaining how those models work. Today, we're going to focus on this kind of fuzzier area in the middle, which is why we devoted a whole webinar to just that one, because it's a little more complicated, a little more nuanced, but I think it also has the most potential and really fits a lot of what we're trying to do in the world of geospatial coordination. But let's just move on quickly to the next slide here. Again, I want you to think about this as a continuum. We see really very few pure examples of everything, when you look at in the real world how these things are implemented, how this framework is implemented. And there's really almost an infinite variety of ways that you can implement them that would kind of slide that thing slightly toward centralized or slightly toward decentralized and so forth. So don't worry about the purity of it. Just think about the key characteristics that make these things work. All right, so let's start with some definition. My apologies, I don't like word slides. I created this slide, so I'm my own enemy here, but I think it's important that we get a clear definition because everybody understands what centralized means, what decentralized means. Federated is a fuzzier notion. And if you think back to the civics class that you probably took in 6th or 7th grade where they explained the US Constitution, you maybe remember that the way our federated model of government works in the United States is that there are certain functions that are handled by the federal government, like national defense, and the Constitution defines those things that happen at that level, and everything else belongs to the states. So states have the authority to implement their own laws. And in New York State where I live, you can't buy wine in the grocery store. That's something that hasn't been implemented in the state of New York where other states have, just to throw out a trivial example here. But when we talk about federated in the context of these enterprise data models, what it really is fundamentally about is a shared authority. And I want to break that down a little bit because what we're talking about normally is in a federated approach, there's generally local government element, which might be counties, it might be municipalities, it might be the PSAPs. And in a federated model, they are going to have authority over the data. They are the source and the owners, the authority on that data. And the higher level organization, which is very often a state, but it's not necessarily a state. It might be a council of government, for example. Well, and actually just last week, was looking at the Cincinnati area. They've created an organization called CAGIS, which is incorporated as a 501c3 to provide a structure for the locals in the Cincinnati area to participate. So I'm saying state, but it could be something else. And what happens in a federated model is that higher level organization has authority over a framework that makes it possible for all that data to come together. So they're generally enabling the assembly and aggregation of the data. They're enabling processes to validate it against an agreed upon standard. And they're generally also provisioning a way to distribute that data. So there's some economies of scale that happen because it's more efficient to do things this way. but it does not change the ownership and the authority structure where that data originated and continues to be owned and under the jurisdiction of those local entities. And that's really the most important element of this. And often what we see is that in these structures, let's just use a state and counties just to keep it simple here, there's often a wide range of capabilities among those counties to take on the roles that would normally be associated with control of that data, such as doing the edits to the data to keep it maintained. And under a federated model, that county has the choice of doing those things themselves, or they can delegate that role to someone acting on their behalf. It might be a contractor. It might even be staff in the state GIS office that perform those edits on behalf of the county. But in all cases, the county would sign off on those edits and really owns the edit, the fact that they didn't perform it themselves notwithstanding. So that shared authority structure is really the key to how this federated model works. So let's move on. I think I want to answer the question of why on earth are we talking to folks from Kansas today? Back in the summertime, I was taking a look at the National 911 Annual Report, which is a publication that's available on 911.gov, which is the National 911 Office. And every year, they put out a very detailed survey to the states, collecting information about the status of 911. And it's published at the end of the following year. So we haven't yet got the 2020 annual report. The 2019 is still the most current one. And this is a graphic from page 67 out of that report. So it's about 2/3 of the way through. There's a lot of questions in here, but this one is very interesting. This question asks the states, what maturity level does your state fall in for the category of GIS data? And if you look at the legend, there are 5 levels that they could answer, with the highest level being something called jurisdictional end state, which means that they actually have all of the 911 data in the standards format ready to do call routing, that jurisdictional end state. And if you look at the map, the light green colors on the map are the 5 states, 4 of them in New England and Kansas, that reported in 2019 that they are at the jurisdictional end state. In other words, they've got all the GIS data needed for NextGen 911 ready and operational. And I thought it was very interesting. And I called and talked to folks in each of those states. And it's very interesting because in the small, more compact New England states where counties really don't even have much of a role, it's direct, municipal level government dealing with the states in New England. And in those 4 New England states that are at that jurisdictional end state, all 4 of them are operating a centralized model for how they're provisioning the NextGen GIS data. But Kansas, the 5th of those 5 states at that level, when I talked to them, I learned about a very sophisticated and well-developed federated model. And so that's how we ended up talking with them today.
All right, well, let's not keep the audience in suspense any longer. Let's dive into the conversation and hear directly from Ken and Eileen. Ken and Eileen, let's start at the beginning. Can you take us back briefly and tell us how this all got started? And what challenge was there laid before you at the beginning?
Sure. Well, I think we both remember it quite vividly. So when we first got introduced to representatives from our state 911 council, this is kind of abbreviated here, but it said we have a plan, we have funding, and then the third bullet there was our timeline for geospatial call routing is 2 years from now. And this is back in 2013-14, I think. So our reaction in the meeting was, great, sounds like a great opportunity, happy to be of service. Back in the office, it was more of this, which I've used this slide before, which this is pretty accurate. It was, we know this is a heck of an opportunity. We can't afford to turn it down. We want to be involved, but we really have no idea what we just signed up for. This also coincided, many of you probably know Ivan Weichert, who was our former state GIO. with him letting me know he was retiring from state government. So huge project, new initiative. We don't know exactly what we're getting into. And Ivan, who had been involved in some of the early stages of the planning of this, was retiring. So we were very excited, but this is also the big, insert your own expletive moment. And the more I look at that while this is meant to be comical, I think that graphic of the panic cycle is very real. It was panic attack and then fear of another panic attack that caused you to have another one. So, but it was really a lot of opportunity. And so we broke that down pretty quickly. We didn't go into this with this perfect plan of exactly what we're going to do. So in 2021, we go, yeah, that was exactly how we drew it up. It was a kind of a core group of myself and Eileen and Sherry Massey, who's kind of our geospatial call routing 911 subject matter expert. She's been our translator through this project of, she came from 911 and GIS. She understood the alphabet soup of both. So she's been critical to our success. But, then we had NINA, the NINA standard was still in draft, so we didn't have our own standard. The council was getting ready to start making data remediation funds available. We didn't have a process. We didn't have a standard. So we agreed first on, we need to let those that are going to submit data know, in our phrase, it was, what does right look like? We need to have that standard. We need to be able to articulate that standard. And in full disclosure, we borrowed heavily from the state of Tennessee. I called Dennis Peterson, did some Googling, found what the state of Tennessee had done. And it was like, okay, the model, it was the format of their standard that was just beautiful. And we sort of filled in our own specifications, but how they had drafted that was really kind of a work of art that is still reflected in our document today. But it was things like that. We need a standard, we need a process, we need a committee, we need a submission process, we need to do outreach. And so while we didn't have all those things lined out, we pretty quickly identified what we needed, and it was a lot. And from there, we kind of had our starting point. So that calmed fears a little bit. We knew there was a ton of work ahead, but we had a plan of attack, so to speak.
And clearly, you did transition from that moment of panic into, establishing a plan and ultimately into action. And, this is a success story after all. So, maybe Eileen, from your perspective, you can tell us a bit more.
Sure. So I like that we moved from the panic slide to this one, because we jokingly said we went from the oh no slide to the oh yeah slide. Because, hey, there was money. We had a unified purpose. We knew that lives depended on this data, and this was a great opportunity to really elevate GIS data across the state and across many agencies and partners. So we knew this was a tremendous opportunity, and the fact that updated current GIS data is actually being used by our 911 operators across the state now attributes to the great success. And the great side benefit is our telecommunicators are now what we call our eyes on the data. They have a big part in reporting data errors or updates that are needed or things like that. So a lot more people know how to spell GIS now than they used to.
Well, I see this is quite a timeline you've got here. And I think what you can see here, there's 8 years worth of activity since you started in 2013, and this slide ends at 2020. So there's actually 9 years, about a decade that this story's been evolving. Without getting too granular in here, I'd like to hear a little bit about how this thing evolved. Just can you walk us through the key points on this timeline that got us to today?
Sure. Yeah. So as Ken said, panic was about 2013. That's when that set in. And referring back to your data models, at that time, we really were a very decentralized model. A lot of the locals had some sort of a data. Some of the data layers that we knew were going to be needed for Next Gen 911, but how it was formatted, stored, who had it was just all over the place. So we quickly launched into, okay, what's GIS piece in this whole pie? And the first piece was to see, okay, let's look at some pilot GIS data. I think we picked 3 different counties and said, okay, what do you have? Give it to us. Let's take a look. And we realized, okay, we got a lot of work to do. So that led to, hey, there's funding. through this program, which was a huge push with this, that we had actually money to start looking at the data, evaluating it, and bringing it up to a standard. So that's what launched the whole state GIS enhancement project, which really went through 3 phases of a gap analysis, data remediation to actually bring it up to the standard, and then moving into data validation and data maintenance. So those things, as you can see in the slide, I know there's a lot of words here, but those things all were kind of taking place really between 2014 to 2016, until we really officially moved into PSAPs were, required to submit GIS data maintenance. That adheres to the standard. It's gone through validation. And I think something else to keep in mind is, while we're doing all this timeline is just GIS focused. The 911 folks on their side were doing the whole IT piece as well, getting the network set up and, everything enabled on their end. So it's definitely a multi-year process. Definitely had to think about things like standards, governance, like we talked about the authority, who does what are the roles and responsibilities. And we identified that every PSAP had to have a GIS data steward and a GIS data maintainer. So we could fulfill those roles. That one role would really have to be with the PSAP, someone who works with the PSAP, and then the other one could be a vendor representative, but we had to make sure someone local was responsible for the data actually getting maintained and submitted to the standard. So then up to about 2019, it was really, I hate to say voluntary participation, but it really was. There was no mandate or anything in place that that the PSAPs had to submit their data. So finally in 2019, they did put a mandate in place. We didn't really have to have that though, because we have had 100% participation from PSAPs across the state since we launched and started this project, and since we required maintenance submissions. So while it is kind of a little bit of a safety blanket to have that required submission mandate now, luckily we've had participation from the beginning and great interest in the project. So lots of moving parts and things that happened there, but over the years, it all came together.
Yeah, so I want to unpack that a little bit. And I got to say, as a former state GIO, when I see a status map like this, where you got 100% participation, particularly on what's effectively a voluntary basis, that is very, very impressive. So we're gonna pick this apart a little bit here, because doing that involves a lot of things around authority, roles, workflows, QC, tools, all of that stuff. So I want to start with, just how did you get all those PSAPs to participate?
Yeah, good question. So this is where we kind of like to joke that we cashed in our political capital. DASC has been around for many years, the clearinghouse, and we've done many projects with local and state government. So luckily, we know a lot of our GIS colleagues around the state. So we realized, okay, we really need to be able to support our PSAPs and GIS maintainers through these policies and standards, and build some tools around those, as well as really emphasize outreach, training, support, and all that communication as well. So this is really where the federated model came to fruition without us even realizing that was the path we were headed down. We knew the PSAPs, this wasn't statewide data. This was local owned and generated data, local source data. So we needed to make sure that we supported their business needs, put together some pretty straightforward, easy to understand standards, governance, policies to standardize and make the data usable, but also create some tools for them to be able to update their data, submit their data, and use their data. So it really was a partnership from the beginning. And one of the first things, we do is create the NG91 GIS committee that has local participation in it as well. Because as we were creating these standards and policies and stuff, we wanted to make sure it wasn't just us telling them what to do. We needed their input and understand any challenges that might be on their end as well. So local participation from the very beginning was critical.
And as we know from talking with you already, that getting that local participation really depended on good outreach and consistent outreach. And I'd love for you to share a bit more about that, Ken.
Sure. First disclaimer, the label of GIS Rockstar does not apply to the photo on the left, which is me. But these are stickers that Eileen came up with that were handed out along with bags of candy, which we found to be really effective at various conferences and presentations and training events. But we'll kind of tag team this one. We realized early on, while not knowing exactly what we were going to do with regards to outreach, that this was probably the most critical piece of the program. Eileen, mentioned earlier that the sort of the voluntary aspect to it. Even the system itself, which we'll talk about a little more in a later slide. This was very much of a sales job. PSAPs did not have to come onto the state's hosted solution, but we were at a pretty critical point in the technology laid out across the state. There were a lot of PSAPs back in 2012 and 13 that were on what was called the burning platform. Their vendor was out of business. There were no replacement parts for their their hardware unless you could find something on eBay. So they needed something along with the, so that coincided with the state being, organized with a mandate to implement next generation 911 technologies across Kansas. But the requirement to join that system was not there specifically in the legislation. So we knew outreach in terms of encouraging PSAPs to join the system, that it would save them time and money and kind of put them in a safe place regarding 911 services. That took a lot of work. There were a lot of regional meetings and one-on-one meetings. And from the GIS perspective, we had to get organized in that regard too, to really to sort of better articulate what do we need you to do? How do you adhere? How do you follow the data standard and that sort of thing? And Eileen leads a lot of those outreach efforts from the GIS side of the project, so she can add a little more detail here.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I think our main thing was we decided, let's get in front of people and talk to them anytime we can, especially our GIS data maintainers or our PSAP administrators, so we can explain what GIS is and how it fits into Next Gen 911. And one thing that kind of just coincidentally happened along with this project is I didn't know what Next Gen 911 was. I just knew you called 911 for an emergency if you needed some help. So I feel like we learned along with a lot of our maintainers what 911 was, or Next Gen 911 was. And that helped kind of even further build these relationships. We found out early on, whether we were talking to a regional meeting or specifically to our data maintainers, early on, they're like, okay, so what exactly is Next Gen 911? So we went back to the drawing board a few years ago and created a video, just what is Next Gen 911. So I think us learning together really did help kind of maintain and build that trust with our partners. And, stickers and candy never hurt either. So that was just one of my ways I created this a few years ago, and I love stickers. So everyone got a kick out of getting all of our data maintainers that attend training. They would get a sticker and a bag of candy. So yeah, it's just a constant communication. We haven't been able to get out in person as much as we'd like to, obviously the last couple of years. But we did start a few years ago a quarterly Next Gen 911 GIS user webinar. So every quarter, the key personnel that have to discuss what's going on with the program as far as GIS goes, we'll get on, do some presentation, invite all of our stewards and maintainers to that webinar, and even open up at the end for a question and answer session. So we try to just always have an open line of communication with our maintainers.
I love that sticker, by the way, Eileen. That's great. I could use one myself, hint, hint.
Yeah.
So, thinking back to the defining characteristics of Federated, we're talking about a shared authority model here. And that brings us immediately to the whole governance structure. And so I know you guys have implemented a council, and I want you to kind of take us through how the council administers and governs this process? It kind of, in other words, how do you take care of the governance of that framework piece so that the shared authority of the locals works seamlessly in this whole structure?
Right. As I think with everything along this journey, this was a bit of an evolution as well. Before we had our State 911 Coordinating Council, the predecessor to that was called the Kansas E911 Wireless Advisory Board, which I think did a lot of good work with regard to 911 services across the state, but it wasn't with the vision of a statewide system, and it wasn't with the vision of next generation 911 technology. So there were some good things done there, and then some lessons learned, like funds were made available through the Wireless Advisory Board too, but they weren't necessarily done in a statewide coordinated fashion. So that led up to leadership in the state, and we'll probably mention his name a couple times, but there's a gentleman who was the chair of the Wireless Advisory Board named Walt Way from Johnson County, Kansas, that was really kind of the visionary of all this stuff, and sort of helped draft the Kansas 911 Act that was passed in 2012 that established the council. He was the first chair of the coordinating council. And while there are lots of players here that were significant, his leadership, I think, was really key, and something that we've come to appreciate is technology is great, but the structure was critical. So the 911 Council was formed as a result of our Kansas 911 Act in 2012, and then that also led to, the mandate of that was laid out in the legislation was to usher in next generation 911 technologies across the state. So that left obviously a fair amount of detail, but that was sort of the critical defining moment. The 911 Coordinating Council is what's referred to as a quasi-state agency. So each state will have a different model. I think that's worked very well in Kansas, but every state's going to be a little different. And as a result of that act, the Coordinating Council was able to, sort of peel off a portion of our 911 fee, which back then I think was 53 cents, and it's bumped up a couple times over the year to 60 cents, and it's currently 90 cents. So the council gets a portion of those funds with the idea that it could help guide the implementation of next generation 911. So that act was revised in 2019. Eileen mentioned this earlier about the mandate to submit GIS data. We still mainly rely on relationships and partnerships and providing support and all those good things to really drive GIS data maintenance and submission to this program. But in 2019, we were able to add that requirement to the legislation. And then more recently, there was an administrative reg that was passed requiring that data adhere to the model, that it's maintained, that local jurisdictions follow our governance policy. So as Eileen mentioned, that's more of an insurance policy. We haven't had to go there yet, but it was nice to kind of go from, gee, it would be great if you, to, we do have some teeth if we need to. This slide shows the statewide system, and I think a key takeaway here is the counties in green are on what we call our statewide hosted solution. Orange, they utilize another system. The gray area is the Mid-America Regional Council, which is a council of governments. They have a footprint in Kansas and Missouri as well. In the early days of this project, again, back to that, it was a sales job that led to the outreach. This map was a few counties in green, several counties in orange, counties in blue and purple, which meant this is sort of the stage we're at in outreach. And if they're interested in the service agreement, if they're not, they're mulling it over. And a lot of that work was led by our 911 administrator, again, going out every single county, sometimes multiple times, to have that one-on-one meeting. So where we're at now, where we're not quite there yet, but we're pretty close to the statewide hosted solution managed by our 911 Coordinating Council and then Mid-America Regional Council. I think over time we'll get there, but that was a ton of effort. There was nothing guaranteed that these PSAPs would join. And I think on the upside, that led to the requirement for us to get out and educate as much as we possibly could. the other takeaway here is we sort of took two different paths with this, that the 911 system, the underlying IP network, the migration to the ESINet, all those things, that was one side of the project, but GIS needed to stand alone in many respects. So if a PSAP was on the system or not on the system, or maybe they would come onto the system, that GIS had to be statewide. That regardless of what system they were on, their call takers, their telecommunicators or PSAP should have access to a statewide map, whatever technology they were using. And we've been able to maintain that. I think early on there was concern that if that fell apart, we were in a lot of trouble. And we've had a lot of buy-in, and I think that's led to a lot of other successes in use of the data outside of Next Generation 911, because it's not just pockets of data here and there. It truly is statewide data that's authoritative, that meets a standard and is regularly updated.
Ken, I just want to reiterate that, because this map shows that there are at least 3 different 911 systems being deployed in Kansas. But behind that GIS data that your federated model applies to has 100% participation. So your federated aggregation of all that critical GIS data is really blind to what system it ends up in, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And like I said, over time, we think we'll probably get down to where maybe there's just 2, but that will always be there. The Mid-America Regional Council does a wonderful job. They manage that system. The 2 will interface as they join the ESINet. But the data it just has to be statewide. There are no other ways around it. So we've been fortunate and very thankful that we've been able to maintain that. But I think some of that is the outreach, and then some of that is there's been a lot of interest in adhering to standards and following governance policies and that sort of thing because of the use of the data. So there's something everyone can get behind. It's this: if we are mapping gas stations in Kansas or something, we'd probably have a hard time trying to get everyone to follow along. But this one, it doesn't take a lot of convincing to make people understand the importance here.
Enabling that statewide map definitely requires a shared platform here. I mean, that's what's allowing you to bring together these disparate systems. So I'm sure there are lots of technologists on the call today that would be interested in a few more details about that shared platform. So maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So this is a rather high-level illustration that kind of shows how we shepherd the data through the whole process. It starts off, of course, with the locals submitting their GIS data that they maintain using a toolbox that we created in-house. That's submitted to a portal where it's validated using those same tools. And then it progresses through this process of validation, aggregation, and publication. And part of that is early on, like I said, the NINA standard was still in draft form, and things have changed since then. So this has allowed us to do a lot of post-processing on the back end that we didn't have to put back on the locals to do, whether it was concatenating some fields together or spelling something out or adding Kansas to something. So that kind of allowed us to be integrated into the process. In a few ways. So we were able to receive the data, use it for other Kansas government purposes, as well as make sure we're shepherding it through the process and it adheres to national standards, as well as the requirements for submitting it up to EGDMS and getting ready for the ESINet. And I think kind of back to that whole local participation, there was some comfort level, at least in Kansas. Again, this is what worked for us. And people knew that if something wasn't right, they could call us and they know us. And we would be able to help them investigate the issue and figure it out. So again, that's just kind of how it worked out. For us, there was a lot of tools and things that were built, the toolbox, the Next Gen 911 program portal, as well as a lot of post-processing behind the scenes that this doesn't really illustrate, but it gets to the idea that once it's submitted, we kind of shepherd it through the process and make sure it actually is being used to geospatially route 911 calls.
Great. So I know we've just scratched the surface today, but I wanted to ask you, as you think back, it's been 9 years in this project now, and I'm sure there are things that you, looking back, might have done differently with hindsight, but also things that you're pretty darn sure you chose the right path there. When you look at your project, what would you say are the key success factors to have gotten you to where you are today?
You mentioned the time frame, and we noticed going through some of these photos we threw into the slide deck was, man, we looked a lot younger when we started this project. We'll tag team this one. I'll draw out a couple that are on the slide. That first one is really key, and I think we've always had an appreciation for this in general, but really with respect to the NG911 program was, we walked into that kind of oh crap moment, but the structure was there, and we had a lot of blanks to fill in with regard to GIS in terms of standard and process and governance and training and all those things. But the most important thing was already done. We had a champion, his name's Walt Way. He's since retired, but he was key in establishing the legislation and the council and providing that early vision and leadership. We've had a wonderful team of subject matter experts to work with. So you look at vision and leadership and legislation, the structure and oversight, and funding. And funding is critical here, but really kind of the last bullet there with intent, that all those other things are more important than the funding. We have to have funding to make this happen. But without that sort of organizational structure, however it is in other states, that was critical for us. And then the other one, we had a shared philosophy going in that, if we kind of do this in a vacuum of just 911, that we could meet requirements, but there's a huge opportunity here. So we need to have the mindset of, it's 911 data, but if we only do this for 911 purposes, then this isn't going to work as well, and it probably won't have, that partnership won't last as long. So those to me are kind of a couple of the key success factors. And keep in mind, we didn't go into this with a plan specifically identifying these things. This is very much an evolution and trial and error and that sort of thing. Eileen, you want to tack on to that?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. Everything that Ken mentioned, and kind of emphasize the statewide version. Before we started on this whole road, the counties were looking at their data just for their county. Literally, if a call transferred to the next county, the data stopped. They didn't have any additional information. So everybody wanted to see their neighbor's data. I don't think they just knew how to go about getting it or acquiring it or being able to standardize it to do that. So I think that was a key part, that everyone knew this was life critical data, and they needed to see beyond their little portion of the world. So I think that was a huge reason for the participation and continued participation. And then there's been some other little offset things, like we said, money was involved, which the Coordinating Council sponsors acquiring new statewide imagery every 3 years. And boy, that makes a lot of people happy, because that can be used by the appraisers department and Department of Transportation and so many different partners and agencies. So the project really has grown beyond critical 911 data being usable, but also what other pieces and parts can be pulled in to support really Kansas government as a whole.
I want to take us back about 20 or 30 minutes when I showed that map of the in the National 911 report. There were 5 states that have reached this jurisdictional end state. And if you remember, 4 of them did it with centralized models, and Kansas did it with a federated model. So I want to kind of ask you the what if. Could this have worked in Kansas with either a centralized or even possibly a decentralized model? I mean, when you look back at what you've done and consider that other states have been successful with a different model, what do you make of that?
I think there's it's hard to look at it another way since we've been under this model for so long. So I would say that first, but I think, yeah, it could work under different models for sure. I do think that this is the best model for Kansas. I'm not saying it's the best model for everyone. I think it depends on where you're at with your state GIS program and its relationship to local government. so this is one that seemed to make the most sense for us, but I can't say that we really examined other models. We kind of jumped in, I think, with this model in mind, and had success, so we kept going. I think if things sort of failed along the way, we may have changed course. But like I said, in hindsight, it's kind of hard for us to imagine it another way. And I do think it's allowed us to provide better service to local government and sort of get those benefits outside of Next Generation 911, which is really key. A lot of local jurisdictions here, sometimes we call it a data remediation project that Eileen referred to earlier, but in some jurisdictions, there was no data to remediate. It was very much a data development project. And so, this program helped many of our local jurisdictions not only adhere to Next Generation 911, but out of it, they were able to develop and maintain and utilize road center lines and address points and boundaries and regularly updated imagery and an imagery buyout program. So for many of them, they went from 0 to 60 really quickly. And I think it's that kind of collateral benefit for everyone that helps ensure the long-term success. The locals don't want to see this go away. Our state users, one of the biggest users of our geocoding service is the Department of Health and Environment. They bang away at that thing all day long. So we have so many users, and it's kind of that state we wanted to get to for so long with our GIS program. We had stops and starts and aggregating road center lines from local jurisdictions. And, there's a little bit of money here or there, or some had it and some didn't. The same with address points. And, when NextGen came along, again, there was that realization that if we do this right, not only does it meet a critical need in terms of 911 service, but man, what a benefit to our state GIS program. So we hitched our wagon to this pretty quickly, and it's really been very beneficial. But it's hard for me to sort of imagine it another way. Eileen, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just that I think this just goes to everyone knows their state. Whoever that GIS clearinghouse or authority or regulating body is, you kind of know the lay of the land the best. And we were just fortunate in Kansas. And I'm not saying that everyone has a robust GIS department and staff or anything. I mean, golly, look at our state. We're pretty rural. But it's knowing that there's reasons why people wanted good data. They wanted to have current, up-to-date good data. And in some ways, I think they just were like, can you just give us the processes and the standards and procedures on how to do that? And it's benefited them as well. And a lot of our PSAPs do use a vendor for that process. But again, they quickly jumped into if you tell us the processes, procedures, and policies, we'll jump into that as well. So I think kind of back to Ken's point, Federated worked for Kansas just because we were kind of familiar with, your people, your politics, it's going to work. And this was what was great for Kansas. Locals maintain control with guidance and us making sure the data was standardized and ready for geospatial call routing.
Great. Hey, Ken, you mentioned your state geocoder. I assume that's connected to this data set. You described that?
Yeah. Excuse me. So we have a governance policy that defines requirements for meeting our standard and data submissions. But we have data come in basically daily. So we don't have jurisdictions that update their data necessarily daily, but we receive data submissions throughout the week and month and year. And so we aggregate that data on a weekly basis, and then it goes out through that publication model that Eileen talked about earlier. So we push out to Intrado for EGDMS. We publish a series of map services and geocoders that go into rapid deploy, but we also make that data available to state and local jurisdictions. And probably the most commonly used product of that is our statewide geocoding service, cascading geocoder that goes from address points to road center lines. And again, it's kind of one of those real basic functions, but when you can power that from statewide authoritative data that's regularly updated, and now largely contributed to the NAD, I'll explain that here in a second. That's huge. I can't overstate the importance of that. I think the one thing, and I know there's some questions popping in here, I'll jump to one of them, is one thing where I think Eileen and I have maybe some regret, if that's the right term, is the early stages of this project, the council would establish an MOU with each PSAP that defined, the protocols and procedures and requirements for coming onto this hosted system. Also, part of that dealt with GIS data, and Eileen argued as much as we possibly could that GIS data needs to be made available in the public domain. And we lost that argument. And so it's available to state and local government, and then distribution beyond that, takes approval on a case-by-case basis from each jurisdiction. So you can imagine when somebody says, hey, we want the whole state, well, it's kind of a pain to deal with. So we've had pretty good luck with contributing data to the NAT. I think we're up to 87, 88 counties out of our 105, Eileen. And we'll use maps of shame and things like that to try to shame the rest into participating. But I don't know if we could have had any more impact. Like I said, we argued to the point of being pretty annoying about this, and then we finally had to, give up and move along. But that's one that, if we had it to do over again, that was pretty critical. So we still work on that, but I think I started out with answering a question about a geocoder, Bill. I'm sorry.
No, but you provided a multi-part answer that's probably addresses other things people are curious about.
Yeah, I know we just have a few minutes left, and there are a number of questions that have come in, so maybe we can tackle a couple of those. Amy, are you going to read the questions?
Yeah, happy to.
Perfect.
Because I know you've covered a little bit. So I'm just going to read from the top. And so from Jason, he says, on the building of trust and outreach with locals, what's the structure of staffing to support that work? And what would be an ideal structure of staffing to maintain those connections?
I think we're kind of at an ideal state now, but we were not in the early stages of this. So when this whole program started, we didn't have the staff that we do now at the clearinghouse to support this. But from the 911 council side of things, we had a 911 administrator, and that was it. And so over the journey we've been on here, we've added program manager and implementation technology support specialist. I believe that's the acronym. That was somebody who really was retired from AT&T and had a lot of expertise in Kansas 911, very specifically from the AT&T side of things. We've added a training outreach coordinator and 2 liaisons. Is that right, Eileen? So that side of the house has really grown. So I think we're in a really good place now. But in the early days of the project, that was really being done by one person. Is that an accurate representation, Eileen, do you think?
Yeah, I think from the 911 side, that's true. So for the GIS side, I jokingly say at the beginning of this whole project, we needed to learn what 911 was, and none of us had that in our project or our position descriptions. So it's same thing. It's kind of ramped up. We started with myself and really 2 to 4 staff at DAS working on bits and parts of this. We don't all work just on this. This is one of the things we do, and pulled in staff as needed, whether it was development or web application development or training and support. And we've also heavily relied on our Next Gen 911 GIS committee, especially Sherry Massey, to help with the training and different things like that. So I think we were hoping that the GIS committee would be an even bigger role in training everything, but that's all a volunteer-based committee. Everyone's busy, so a lot of that ended up kind of falling back on DASC to be responsible for. So I agree with Ken. We're now finally positioned well to handle that. So we have Ken and I are both on the committees and different things to support this project. Then I do most of the project management side of things, and I have. It's funny the way to answer this question, but I have 3 to 4 staff underneath me because one's transitioning to another position, but we just hired 2 new people. So eventually I'll have 3 under me that work partly on Next Gen 911 as well as another web application developer who does as well. So again, not everyone works just on 911, but it definitely consumes quite a bit of our time. And realizing that you need to figure out if you have the resources to support this is a very important point.
So our next question asks, did Kansas use a vendor to assist in aggregation of statewide data? Any learned in this area? How are counties without strong GIS staff supported?
So we did not use a vendor to assist in the aggregation. We use the vendors for the enhancement project, which was the gap analysis, the data remediation, and the initial QA of that remediated data. But we realized pretty quickly once we were getting into maintain data that we needed to be kind of that central role to be able to consume and process that data and aggregate it. So we've taken on that role, and we do that portion of the data processing. Anything learned in this area? Every day. I mean, there's always something, whether it's making sure we're adhering to the NENA standard. There's been a lot of post-processing growth because we need to make sure we're adhering to our industry partner requirements as well. So a lot of things there. So I'd say that portion is always tweaking, changing a little bit. And to your question of how counties are without strong GIS staff are supported, that kind of goes back to the governance that we expected them to have either someone in-house or a vendor to be able to maintain this data, and also really emphasize that even if they don't have a GIS staff internally, they need to be reporting these updates to their vendor on a scheduled basis. So that's really, it was kind of more role and governance that put a lot of that into place.
And if I could tack onto that one, I know we're going to run out of time here. We could follow up via email on the others. We have roughly 70 to 75% of our jurisdictions hire a vendor to do their data maintenance. We only really have a handful in Kansas that are involved in providing that service. It's around 5, but they are very much a part of the process. And we realized pretty early on as we went through updates to our data model, the first outreach step after it's endorsed by our committee is to those vendors. Some of that self-serving and knowing if, well, we have those vendors on board, we're not going to surprise them with anything. Well, man, there's 75% of the state, we're good. But it was also realizing just, we wanted their input. Like I said, surprises aren't good in this regard. If it was going to change their workflow or something, they need to know before anyone else. And then we would do that same outreach to the local jurisdictions. But the vendor support directly to local governments is huge. It's been good for their business. And oftentimes, if they weren't already, they added on things like parcel mapping and other GIS services. So I think it's really been this program has been a catalyst for not only our statewide program, but local government GIS as well.
I think we have time for one more. What parts of the coordinating council developed the standards, and what was their process?
Well, if we reflect back to that organizational chart, there are tons of subcommittees. Some of them were kind of more temporary, and some have been throughout the life of this project. But we had a GIS committee. It was a subcommittee of the technical committee at the time that developed the GIS standard. And of course, we had to kind of go up through the organizational structure and get endorsement by our full council before it was adopted. But we referenced NENA's draft. We looked at what Tennessee was doing in that regard. But you can see and I think this is a bit dated. It was just what's out on the council's website. But lots of different committees, from admin to technical to ops to GIS, and then related subcommittees. So this is probably the best organized program we've ever been involved in. And then the subcommittees and committees are really targeted very well. So they would develop, the technical committee is the group that developed the RFP that ultimately went out in 2012 or 13. There's a security subcommittee, which brings in subject matter experts from state, local, and private sector and our vendor partners. So those standards and governance policies were really developed by all these different groups. And they live to this day. Those we go through an annual infrastructure planning workshop. We have a 3-day strategic planning retreat I mean, all these groups are kind of brought in to sort of update their piece of the pie.
So it looks like we're at the top of the hour, but to those who have not had your questions answered, just like what Ken said, we will follow up in an email. I will be sure to provide those questions to to Bill and Kate and Eileen and Ken. If you are anyone who hasn't submitted a question but would like to, you're more than welcome to submit it to info@nsgic.org, and I'd be happy to pass those along as well. With that, I'd like to thank our presenters today for this incredible presentation. Any last words from the group?
I just want to thank Eileen and Ken for your time and your efforts and sharing your story. I think it's been really helpful for a lot of folks, and it's certainly been educational for Bill and for me. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing to talk, theoretical, and quite another to talk about the practical realities. You guys have done a great job with that. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us share.
Thank you again for all of you coming on today. It was a great presentation. Thank you to our audience for attending. I hope everyone has a lovely holiday this month.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks. Bye-bye.